People think going broke is dramatic. They imagine a casino table, a failed business, a giant medical bill, a divorce, a market crash. Sometimes it is dramatic. Most of the time, it is quieter than that. Most of the time, you do not go broke because of one catastrophic decision. You go broke because you slowly begin accepting 100 expensive little lies. You call them normal. You call them self-care. You call them investing. You call them upgrading. You call them treating yourself. You call them what successful people do. You call them what adults do. You call them temporary. You call them worth it. And while you are busy calling them by polite names, they are doing one job very faithfully. They are taking pieces of your future and selling them off for comfort in the present. That is what I want to talk about, not because I want to lecture you about buying generic peanut butter. I am not interested in that. I spend money on things I enjoy. I like quality. I like convenience where it truly matters. I like paying for things that genuinely improve life. I have never believed the point of money was to sit in a cave, eating tasteless crackers, congratulating yourself on your purity. The point of money is to build a rich life. But if you do not know the difference between a rich life and an expensive performance, you can waste a fortune while thinking you are just doing what everybody else does. That is the real danger. The source material is strongest when it makes that exact move. It does not argue against spending. It argues against unconscious spending, especially on purchases that feel normal, responsible, aspirational, or worth it, while quietly draining huge amounts of money over time. It attacks cars bought on monthly payments, unused fitness gear, endless miracle products, subscriptions, oversized trucks, self-care, used as rationalized spending, overcomplicated investments, advisor fees, housing myths, and other purchases that consume future wealth while pretending to improve life. Fay Phalocite Fay Turn 23 File 6 Fay Phalocite Fay Turn 23 File 7 Fay Phalocite Fay Turn 23 File 8 Fay. That is a very good spine for a story, and if I were telling it in my own voice, I would say this. Being poor is expensive. Looking rich is expensive. Pretending something is an investment when it is really a luxury is expensive. And almost nobody ever says the quiet part out loud. A lot of what people call a financial plan is just a collection of habits that make them feel temporarily better while making them structurally weaker. That is not a plan. That is drift with a nicer wardrobe. The modern world is very good at selling drift. The car dealership does not ask you what the total cost of the truck is going to be. It asks you what monthly payment feels comfortable. The supplement company does not ask whether you have solved the actual problem. It offers a new miracle bottle. The app does not tell you that frequent trading will likely make you worse off. It wraps the whole thing in dopamine and free stock confetti. The financial advisor does not usually open with iPlan to siphon an astonishing portion of your lifetime returns by charging a percentage of assets. He opens with confidence texture, a handshake, perhaps a nice suit, and the comforting idea that you now have a guy. The realtor does not say, "This house may be a lifestyle choice with high hidden carrying costs." The realtor says, "You are building equity." The whole system is built on emotionally convenient language. That is why ordinary people lose so much money in such ordinary ways. Because the language makes it all sound respectable. I grew up in a world where money mattered because not having it was not theoretical. It changed what the family could do, where you could go, how long you could wait, how much nonsense you could tolerate. That teaches you something important. Money is not just for buying things. It is for buying room, room to think, room to say no, room to walk away, room between what happens to you and what it forces you to do next. That is why I get irritated when people waste money not on joy, but on theater. I have no issue with luxury. I have an issue with unconscious luxury. I have an issue with borrowed luxury. I have an issue with luxury disguised as prudence, wellness, investment, identity, or adulthood. That is what damages people. Let me start where a lot of damage starts. The source is exactly right to attack the habit of buying a car based on monthly payments rather than total cost. That is one of the oldest and most effective traps in American finance. The moment you think in monthly payment terms, the seller gains more room to stretch the loan, add products, shift attention away from total price, and let you leave with something that fits your month while quietly damaging your years. The text correctly points out that total cost of ownership matters: gas, insurance, maintenance, parking, registration, and all the other silent costs that monthly payment thinking encourages people to ignore. File Site Fay Turn 23, File 6, Fay. That is not an accident. It is design. People do not usually buy too much car because they sat down with all the numbers and made a rigorously foolish decision. They buy too much car because someone taught them to ask the wrong question. Can I afford the monthly payment? That is the wrong question. The right question is, what is this machine going to cost me in total, and what will that cost crowd out over the next 5 to 7 years? This is where real financial adulthood begins. Not with a lower monthly payment, with a longer time horizon. A truck that consumes $1,200 a month all in is not just a truck. It is the travel you do not take. It is the investment contribution that never happens. It is the emergency fund that stays weak. It is the extra stress that shows up every time something else breaks. It is your future life converted into steel and ego. The source becomes even more useful when it gets a little rude about trucks and SUVs people do not actually need. Good. Some things deserve rudeness. A person making $65,000 or $70,000 a year who buys a $90,000 truck is not making a subtle financial trade-off. He is making a loud emotional decision and trying to disguise it as practicality. The source correctly points out that many people in financial trouble own expensive trucks or SUVs that are wildly out of proportion to their actual needs. It also correctly suggests the obvious adult question: if you truly need occasional truck capability, could you rent one when you need it rather than carrying a giant monthly burden all year? Fay Turn 23, File 7, Fay Turn 23, File 8, Fay. That is how adults think. Not what feels rugged, what leaves the machine stronger. This same logic appears in smaller corners of life too, which is why the source's discussion of trendy fitness equipment is better than it first sounds. A Peloton that becomes a coat rack, an at-home reformer used twice, a basket of gadgets bought in a burst of inspiration. These are not really about health. They are about buying the fantasy of consistency. The text is right to say that expensive gear does not create habits. Habits create habits. The smarter move is almost always to prove the habit first, then buy the tool if the habit survives. File Site Fay Turn 23, File 6A. This is one of the most expensive patterns in modern consumer life. People buy the identity before they earn the behavior. They buy the planner before they plan. They buy the desk before they work. They buy the shoes before they run. They buy the course before they implement. They buy the reformer before they stretch. They buy the luxury version of the future self, while the current self remains completely unchanged. That is not investing in yourself. That is buying a costume for a character you have not yet become. Sometimes the costume helps. Often it becomes clutter. The source says this beautifully when it talks about aspiration. Fueled shopping. The deck is not really a deck. The deck is sunrise coffee and journaling. The bathtub is not really a bathtub. It is the fantasy of a calmer, more luxurious self. The Porsche is not just a car. It is the version of you that appears inside the commercial. That is exactly right. People often do not buy objects. They buy imagined selves. Fay turn 23, file 6 Fay. That is why so much spending feels powerful in the moment. It is never just the object. It is the projected identity. And projected identity is expensive. A lot of people think money discipline means saying no. I do not agree. I think money discipline means learning to say no to fantasy purchases that are pretending to be action. If you want the sunrise, go outside tomorrow morning. If you want to stretch your hips, use the floor. If you want to know whether driving a Porsche is meaningful to you, rent one for a day. If you want to meditate, close the door and sit down. The object is often not the answer. The behavior is. Now let me say something else that many people need to hear. Not every expensive thing is foolish. Some things are worth paying for. The source actually handles this nuance well when it says some things are fine to buy cheaply, but for items that matter deeply and are used often, a higher quality version may be better, especially if you keep it for a long time. That is a sensible philosophy. Buying the best you can afford for the few categories that truly matter can be smarter than buying 3 mediocre versions that disappoint you. The key is that best does not mean most expensive. It means best for you. Fay file site, Fay turn 23, file 8 Fay. That is an adult distinction, because the answer is never boy the cheapest of everything. That is a teenager's idea of financial wisdom. The answer is know what matters enough to deserve quality, and know what does not deserve much money at all. That is why I like the source's concept of money dial so much. Spending more where you genuinely get disproportionate joy, and spending much less where you do not, is a much better philosophy than blanket guilt or blanket indulgence. The whole point is intentionality. Once you know what truly matters, you can cut mercilessly elsewhere without feeling deprived. Fay site, Fay turn 23, file 6 Fay. That is how a rich life is built. Not by spending less on everything, by aligning spending with reality. And one of the greatest enemies of aligned spending is subscription drift. The source is very good here too. Subscriptions feel harmless because no single charge is large enough to trigger fear. But they become dangerous because they crowd out room for what truly matters while tying up money in decisions you made months or years ago. The line, "Where did all my money go?" That's where it went, to decisions you made 18 months ago, is excellent. Because it captures the deadness of this spending. You are not even actively choosing it anymore. It is just happening to you. Fay site, Fay turn 23, file 8 Fay. That is an important distinction. Active joy is one thing, passive leakage is another. And a lot of modern finance is just passive leakage wearing the costume of convenience. That is why quarterly statement reviews are so valuable. They are not only about finding fraud or checking balances, they are about reclaiming authorship. Which of these services do I use? Which do I love? Which are merely hanging around because I hate the minor discomfort of canceling them? The source is exactly right to say you should be ruthless here. Ruthless is a good word, not cruel. Ruthless, because dollars tied up in dead subscriptions are dollars unavailable for your real life. Fay site, Fay turn 23, file 8 Fay. This same drift appears in personal care and self-care too. The source is very sharp when it goes after endless supplement, skincare, and grooming product churn. Buying a new miracle bottle every week is rarely self-improvement. It is usually procrastination by purchase. The text even says it directly. If you are constantly chasing the next miracle product, you are not solving the problem. You are postponing the more honest work of consistency. Pick one, use it for 30 days. If it fails, cut it. That is sane advice. Fay site, Fay turn 23, file 6 Fay, and then it gets even sharper with emotional spending disguised as self-care. That is one of the best sections in the whole source. A massage, a fancy brunch, a little "I deserve this" spending hit can be perfectly fine if you can actually afford it. But if it goes on a credit card you are already carrying, it is not really self-care anymore. It is stress spending. The source frames this very well by saying real self-care should be planned for inside a conscious spending plan. If you already set the money aside, then you can enjoy it, honestly. If you are borrowing to feel better for 1 hour, that is something else. Fay-Felicite Fay Turn 23 File 7 Fay Turn 23 File 11 Fay. That is a very useful distinction. Real self-care reduces stress. Borrowed self-care postpones stress and adds interest again. I am not against pleasure. I am against dishonest pleasure. Pleasure that knows where the money came from is healthy. Pleasure that pretends the money question does not exist is often just anesthesia. And anesthesia is expensive when used as a lifestyle. Now let us move into the part where people get angriest: complexity. The source is very good and frankly very funny when it attacks overcomplicated or cult, like investment products, especially the ones sold to people who feel behind and want a shortcut. Crypto rescue fantasies, infinite banking, EOLs, tax shelter stories, whiteboard, level over-engineering, gamified trading apps, all of these fit the same emotional pattern. Complexity is being sold as sophistication, when what is actually being sold is confusion. The source says it bluntly: complexity is not a strategy. It is a distraction. That is exactly right. Fay-Felicite Fay Turn 23 File 11 Fay. I have always thought people are most vulnerable to financial nonsense at the exact moment they begin feeling financially embarrassed. When someone feels behind, he does not want fundamentals. He wants redemption. And redemption is where scammers live. They love the person who is ashamed of being ordinary because ordinary solutions will not satisfy his ego. He wants 20% returns. He wants access. He wants the thing rich people supposedly do. He wants a secret. And once a person wants secrets more than structure, he is prey. This is why I have such respect for simple index funds, target date funds, and automated plans. The source says this directly too: low-cost index funds with tiny expense ratios, automated investing, getting on with your life. This is the path. It sounds too simple to people who have been trained to think serious finance must be complicated. That is precisely why it works. Fay-Felicite Fay Turn 23, File 11 Fay Turn 23, File 5 Fay. The world can sell complexity. It has a much harder time selling simplicity. Simplicity is not flashy enough. That is good. Flashy is often expensive, and simplicity becomes even more powerful when you understand how much the wrong complexity can cost. The source's discussion of AUM fees is one of the most important parts of the whole document. A 1% assets under management fee sounds harmless to many people. But the source correctly points out that over a long investing lifetime, such a fee can consume roughly a quarter of your returns or more, costing hundreds of thousands of dollars. The numbers are brutal specifically because the fee compounds against you year after year. Fay-Felicite Fay Turn 23 File 5 Fay Turn 23 File 2 Fay. This is one of the great tragedies of modern upper-middle class finance. People become frugal over tiny categories and casual about enormous silent percentages. They comparison shop for crackers, then hand away a quarter of their future to a system that feels professional. That is upside down thinking. I am not against advice. I am against lazy fee structures. The source handles that nuance well. It says there are good reasons to hire a financial advisor, especially for complex planning or behavioral coaching, but paying by flat fee, hourly fee, or project fee is often much more sensible than granting a perpetual percentage of your growing wealth. That is the adult answer. Pay people well for real expertise. Do not offer them a permanent tax on your net worth for making you feel like you have a guy. Say file a site Fay turn 23 file, 5 Fay turn 23 file 2 Fay. That sentence matters. Have a guy. Americans love having a guy for the lawn, a guy for the house, a guy for money. The problem is that feeling well looked after is not the same as being well served. Again, language, always language. Now let us talk about the thing Americans treat like a holy relic. The house, the source's treatment of primary residences is outstanding because it does something most people are too emotionally weak to do. It says the house is often not an investment in the way people imagine. Between mortgage interest, taxes, maintenance fees, closing costs, and the giant opportunity cost of equity tied up in a single illiquid asset, the house may be a wonderful place to live without being a superior financial asset. The text correctly argues that many people buy homes because they were told renting is throwing money away, not because they actually ran the numbers on the largest purchase of their lives. Fay file a site Fay turn 23 file 6 Fay. That is one of the most expensive myths in America. Not because owning is always wrong, because owning is treated as automatically right. Nothing large should be automatic. Not marriage, not children, not business, not houses, and certainly not houses bought under pressure from cultural scripts. The source also goes further in a very useful way when it notes that once you have higher income, you still do not have to buy a house just because the culture expects you to. Renting can mean freedom, mobility, optionality, and the ability to invest elsewhere. It points out that in very expensive markets, the math often favors renting and investing the difference for long periods. This is a sane counterweight to the American reflex that calls renting failure and buying maturity. Fay file site Fay turn 23 file 2 Fay. That is an important point. A lot of people do not want a house. They want the identity of someone who owns a house. Those are not the same. And identity purchases are almost always expensive. This same logic appears again with renovations. The source is brutal and correct when it says that Americans wrap renovations in investment language because they do not want to admit they enjoy luxury. A nicer faucet, a basement, a deck, a remodel. These may all improve your life. Fine, say that. But most are not magical investments that pay for themselves. They are lifestyle choices. Once you admit that the next adult question becomes obvious, can I actually afford this from my real spending system, or am I borrowing against the future for a story I enjoyed telling about this purchase? Fay file site Fay turn 23 file 6 Fay. This may be the most important pattern in the whole source. Luxury disguised as investment. It shows up in mattresses. It shows up in skincare. It shows up in home gyms. It shows up in home remodels. It shows up in trucks. It shows up in investing in myself. It shows up everywhere. I do not object to luxury. I object to lying. If you want the luxury, say so. Then save for it honestly. That is strength debt, financed luxury wrapped in wellness, equity, or productivity. Language is weakness in expensive clothing. The source becomes even more useful near the end when it attacks rewards credit card behavior. Paying 27% interest to earn points worth a penny is one of the clearest examples of intelligence being outrun by ego. The text says it perfectly, stepping over $100 bills to pick up a fraction of a cent. That is what rewards optimization becomes when it exists on top of revolving credit card debt. Faithfully cite Fay turn 23 file 6 Fay again. The pattern repeats. People love optimization theater. It feels sophisticated. It lets them imagine they are being clever. But cleverness that ignores structure is usually just another form of expensive denial. The same goes for education products, which the source also handles well. Buying online courses, conferences, and premium information products without implementation is not investment in yourself. It is consumption wearing an educational costume. The text is wise to say that action creates results, not inspiration alone, and that buying more solutions, while still in credit card debt, is often just piling one form of avoidance on top of another. Felicite Turn 23 File 6 Fe. This is another version of buying the identity before earning the behavior. The course buyer says, I am the kind of person who improves. The investor in complexity says, I am the kind of person who knows secrets. The luxury spender says, I am the kind of person who has arrived. The house buyer says, I am the kind of adult who builds equity. The metal card carrier says, I am the kind of traveler who matters. So much spending is status with a plausible story attached. That is why the status credit card section works too. The source points out that thick metal cards, lounge access, concierge perks, and all the rest may be nice if you truly use them. But if you are paying annual fees for a feeling of importance at the gate twice a year, then you are buying status more than utility. The adult answer is not never have nice cards. It is audit the actual value of the perks and cut the ego tax if the usage is not there. File Site Turn 23 File 6 Fe. That is how adults should think about almost everything. Not what story does this item. Let me tell. What does it actually do? What does it cost? What does it crowd out? Does it fit inside the life I am deliberately building? Or is it another object I bought to feel slightly more complete for 15 minutes? Now, let me step back and say what I think the whole source is really about. It is not about waste in the abstract. It is about unconscious substitution. People substitute spending for clarity. They substitute image for confidence. They substitute products for habits. They substitute complexity for competence. They substitute ownership for analysis. They substitute monthly payments for affordability. They substitute points for wealth. They substitute identity for actual financial strength. That is what drains the future. Not one big dramatic error. 100 socially accepted substitutions. And this is why I think the best line buried inside the whole source is not really a line about any one purchase at all. It is the line about spending intentionally and even spending more on the things you love once you stop wasting money on the things that do not matter. That is the right philosophy. This is not a sermon on deprivation. It is a demand for honesty. Cut the leaks. Kill the theater, free the cash, then spend lavishly where it actually creates joy, meaning health, convenience, generosity, or freedom. File Site Turn 23, File 6 Fe. That is how rich people should think. Not rich-looking people. Rich thinking people. Because wealthy thinking is not about spending nothing. It is about refusing to let your dollars drift into categories that quietly weaken you while making you feel momentarily normal. That is the trap. Normal is expensive in a consumer culture built to monetize your insecurity. So if I were to reduce the whole source to one Buffett-style principle, it would be this. The fastest way to become poor is not one giant mistake. It is repeatedly spending on things that look normal, feel justified, and quietly sell off the future you actually want. That is the real danger, and the answer is not guilt. The answer is authorship. Know your money dials. Know what matters. Know the categories that are lying to you. Know which purchases are identity, purchases which are actual joys, and which are just leakage in a prettier package. Then cut hard where the money is dead. Spend gladly where the money is alive. Invest the difference. And let time build the life that unconscious spending would have quietly stolen. That is the kind of rich I respect. Not visible abundance. Directed money. Because directed money becomes freedom. And drift becomes regret. That is the whole game. Not crackers, not coffee, not tiny guilt. The whole game is whether your money is serving the life you truly want, or the story you have been sold about who you are supposed to look like? Most people never ask that question, the people who do get rich in ways the others do not understand. And it usually starts with something very simple. They stop calling their leaks normal. They start calling them expensive.